Welcome to Rauta's Crash Course to Norwegian Black Metal since the 90s, episode 10. This time we have three bands which I've decided to lump up together because, well, they all made style changes along the way, some more than others, but nonetheless, none of these bands kept it very true to one given style, but went different directions. Now, of course, this is very true for a lot of bigger names. I mean, whether we're talking about Burzum, Darkthrone, Mayhem, you all had those style changes, including bands like Immortal, Enslave, etc. But now we're talking in the mid-size territory, and these are a little bit different. I mean, after all, Immortal kept it going all the way black metal, but these bands, well, let's say these made more drastic changes. Now Darkthrone and Burzum are calling us like, what the hell are you talking about? We made bigger changes. We made more drastic changes. Now, this is not about comparing which made the biggest or the worst changes. These are just, like I said, lumped up together because of this reason. Now, the bands in question in this episode are Aeternus, Gehenna, and Hades, or Hades Almighty. Some people might say Hades. Let's go and talk about these bands in question, starting with Aeternus, 1993 Bergen. Like a lot of people out there already know, Bergen is the hub for Norwegian black metal, the focal point when it comes to Norwegian black metal. A lot of great bands and less great bands emerge from the very same city. Where we're talking about bands like Tolke or Gorgoroth or Aeternus and Slave, you get the idea. Immortal, you all have those roots for the city surrounded by mountains. A wonderful city, by the way, and definitely worth visiting. But we're not talking about geography or history so much outside the bands. We're focusing on these three bands, and Aeternus was there quite early on, 1993. And already 1994 they had a demo in the making. That means, well, they were not there with the first wave. I'm talking about the bands that already, like Mayhem and, well, Darkthrone, which already started in the late 80s but turned into black metal early 90s. Well, that was soon followed by bands like Immortal and all that stuff. So bands that already had out an album by, say, 1991. Well, Aeternus kept a couple of years later, but still earlier than some of those bands that came out late 90s. So early on, doing their stuff, which was labeled as, well, you guessed it right, black metal. And then they had EP, Dark Surgery. And then started happening something that we call full albums, 1997, Beyond the Wandering Moon. And so the night became 1998 and Shadows of Old 1999. The pace was strong and fast and all that stuff, but that didn't stop the band changing. That means whatever you have already here listed as black metal early, death metal later. Now, with bands have that kind of labeling, that style change and all that stuff, it's sometimes hard to figure out, so when did exactly they change? A lot of bands had like few albums in before changing style, or in Darkthrone's case, one death metal album and 10 black metal and whatever happened later on. But Aeternus was actually quite quickly to do in an inverted ways. I mean, a lot of black metal bands started with death metal. Be it about Burzum, be it about guys from Immortal. They had their death metal past. We're gonna talk about that later on, mind you. But Aeternus went other ways. I mean, other directions. They started more like black metallic in the beginning. And quite quickly they decided to do their own style of death metal, which is, in my opinion, rather unique, or at least not so typical ones. Whether we're talking about Swedish death metal or American death metal or death metal from other parts of the world, most of them don't really sound like Aeternus. That is dark and heavy, almost sometimes flirting with so-called death doom. But then again, the doominess is not that much prevalent there. I mean, it's dark, definitely. Some might even say it's kind of a darkened death metal in so many ways. And yes, the doominess also comes into play when we're talking about mid-tempo or slow tempo in some ways. But yeah, it's death metal, and only later on it became more Americanized, if you will. I mean, there are parts later on here, albums like Ascension of Terror, Darker Monument, you will have some kind of a Morbid Angel vibe seeping in, and that is of course something different that in the early on. But it's interesting to understand how the music is done. I mean, while they started as black metal band, that phase, if you can call it that, didn't last too long. But quite quickly, early on, I would say even since the first album, the death metal was definitely way more dominant. You have those growly vocals, you have that really heavy production, which is kind of incredible considering that these guys were nobodies with the first album, and that means a lot of bands don't really have the good budget, good learning experience and all that stuff to do albums sounding so good. I mean, these albums definitely have stood the test of time. They can really challenge a lot of nowadays albums with their production and all. And of course there's deep growly vocals. However, early on these albums, like Beyond the Wandering Moon for instance, these albums were massive. More than 60 minutes of death metal. And that is something like too much. Don't get me wrong, it doesn't matter how long you are if you're doing a good album, but sometimes too much is literally too much, meaning it's sometimes hard to go through some 65 minutes of death metal when you just feel like, I'm done by 40. The same thing was happening with the second album, also over 60 minutes in length. So it's kind of curious that later on when you take a look at these lengths, it kind of gets shortened. By the way, this is one of the most horrible album covers from Norway ever. What were these guys thinking? Luckily the album is way better than the album cover. But already that was less than 53 minutes. And the longer you go, now it's less than 45 minutes. See the pattern here. And you get the idea. Here we have 45 minutes again. But for example, Heathen as late of 2018, this is only 35 minutes. Which is definitely, in my opinion, quite perfect for these kind of albums. Now, mind you, Aeternus never changed their style too much after the first changes. And I think that's a good thing because once they kind of found out like this is the kind of a death metal we want to go and done and all that stuff, they just keep going on and figure out their own style. Of course, it's not for everybody because it lacks the speed or brutality, which definitely came on like a storm later on by a lot of bands in the death metal department. But at least they kept their own thing going on. And this is pretty interesting because if they take a look at the members list, only one original member from 1993, Ares, who actually was lucky to get to interview at Beyond the Gates Festival in August 2023. And we spoke about the history and, musical styles and all that stuff. So all the other guys in the band joined a lot later. So what you have in the past members this is quite big if you really think about it. You have all these people who went into different bands. You will notice different bands mentioned here. Obtain Enslavement, Ancient, and all that stuff. Helheim. A lot of people have been coming and going from the black metal scene as well, being part of the band. So it's interesting. My point here is Aeternus is so tightly knit to black metal scene and community and all that stuff, even though being death metal band, much like Cadaver. I mean, these guys are part of the same scene, even though they're just doing their death metal thing versus black metal thing. So it's an interesting band and definitely kind of a timeless, in my opinion. Definitely worth listening to. Maybe they never made those big hit albums, if you will, compared to say bands like D-Side, Bolthor, Cannibal Corpse and the like. But I mean, they really, really nailed it with their own style. And I think that's worth of respect because they also never made a weak album. And that's something to consider as well. But that's about Aeternus, a band that has been here 30 years and still making new music. Philosopher is supposed to be out this November. So, right, only a few weeks later after this video, so let's hope it's going to be a good one. Then we have Gehenna, which is a little bit different city, Stavanger. Not that far away from Bergen, but still I think a couple of hours. So different scene in that respect. And they also started in 1993 and also made demo and EP the very same year. So quite hectic with the pace and all that stuff. Now it took couple of years for them, however, to go on first full album. But before we talk about that, it's worth mentioning that they did this EP called First Spell, which I think really put them on the map. Yes, they were keyboard oriented or driven black metal with lots of atmosphere, not as very much like raw or grim or super dark black metal, but putting the keyboards on the map and saying like, yes, you have other bands going all the way symphonic and all the way aggressive and all the way sinister places. We do it in a more moderate fashion. And First Spell was, I think, a good starting point. Not literally starting point because they had the demos and EP before that, but I think that's something that many people referred to as like the Gehenna starting point. Now, Seen Through the Veils of Darkness, which is also known as the second spell, kind of kept going on after that one, now being in a full album length and all that stuff. Very much keyboards in the play and the kind of a green black metal, but like I said, more on the mid-tempo section rather than all the way immortal and etc. But in my opinion, their best album probably is the third spell, Malice, which came out in 1996, and I think that's when I heard it for the first time. I remember a song played on the local metal show, radio that is, in Finland. And that was like the song I heard. I was like, yes, this is something that I am very, very much interested in. And this is basically the same style, but in more honed, more polished fashion than the two first releases before that. I'm saying once again these two because I really consider first spell as the real starting point. And Malice is more like picking from the pieces of first spell and second spell, but in my opinion better. Now, on Metal Archives, they seem to agree, but I remember seeing that on, for example, Radio Music, I think Seen Through the Veils of Darkness was actually listed as the best one, ranked the best one. Some people really seem to, like first and second spell more than whatever happened after that. But for me, Malice, or the third spell, is the one that really, nails it. I mean, it's kind of a diverse album. There are lots of things going on. It even has this dark ambient parts, or similar to that. And also really, really catchy parts. And also good production, good vocals and all that stuff. Something that is actually worth mentioning. I mean, basic black metal band always has kind of like good black metal vocals. Most of them don't have really bad ones. But then there are good ones and really good ones. And I would say Gehenna has more on the real good ones. Not my actually favorite ones, but still on the better side of things. Now, Admiron Black then came as a third album in 1998. And that started to include a little bit more like death metal vibes, which then came into play with the album called Murder. And I think that's part of the reason why it's rated a little bit less than those albums before, because the style change was probably too much for some people. I mean, after all, they kind of jumped the ship. I don't know why they decided to go the same way as, say, Aeternus, but later on, whereas a lot of bands went, indeed, the different order, from death metal to black metal, but Gehenna was like, okay, fuck it. Maybe that was the Cyclone moment, as reference to band Cyclone and Emperor. So abandoning black metal in favor of death metal. But what is interesting is, however, Gehenna came back. So they kind of later on abandoned their death metal parts to favor black metal once again with WW and Unravel. And this is why it's later on here listed like black metal early and later, and black death metal as mid. Now, whether you call it Admiron Black, Black Death, or Murder Black Death, or just death metal, it's up to you. But I am definitely putting it more on the side of death metal things. But WW is maybe more black death. So there's kind of like a triangle. You start with black metal, going to black death metal, and then you come back. Or you could see the shape V starting from up and down and whatever. That's not the point. This is not a reference to quality so much, but just like, making those steep turns and all that stuff. Unravel, however, is not among their best ones. So I would say they're a little bit clumsy and bumpy later on, where in my opinion their peak moments are definitely albums like Malice and Admiron Black. However, Gehenna is still very much in the game, even though there has been 10 years since the previous album. So we'll see about whatever kind of a turn of events there will be. Also worth taking a look at the band members list. Very much like Aeternus, only one original member from 1993, Senreb, which is a key element of not only Gehenna, but has also played in various other bands as a live member, like this Mayhem, Satirican Talke, etc. And these other guys, well, they are newer members of the band. Indeed, nice folks. I got to talk to them at Steelfest 2023, so can't say nothing bad about them. But this also puts us to see them as members list, when this is quite a list indeed. You see a lot of members, some are more live only maybe, but nonetheless a lot of people, live musicians, The list is big, as well as the past members. One interesting is, for example, Deirdre Rep, which you might have seen on Talker interview lately as a visitor. He also had quite a list of interesting names along the line, like Korkoroth and Orchestus, Enslaved, and all that stuff. So yeah, indeed, Gehenna has featured quite a few interesting musicians along the way, and in my opinion, it's a good band, and people should give it more attention that it's coming. But maybe lack of albums lately has really been putting them off the map, and that's something that can't be helped too much when you don't do more albums. And lastly, we have Hades Almighty. I'm saying Hades because back in the days, of course, we were saying Hades before it turned into Hades Almighty or Hades. And this was, I think, because of an American band. Yeah, it's actually here said that there was Hades for the first two albums, and they were kind of a forced to change their name, despite being as early as 1992. Once again, from Bergen. Now, this is a curious story with the band because, I mean, they did this to first album, after demo that is, 1994, 1997, with the name Hades. And then they started changing. And that's why they are listed here as Black Viking Metal, early / progressive black metal later. Whether it's a progressive or kind of avant-garde later on, that's up for debate. But yeah, they really started changing their style, almost like with the name change. Millennium Nocturne is already kind of a pivotal moment because it kind of has these Bathory Viking era reminiscent parts, but a lot of weird parts. I mean, starting with the kind of opera singing style of intro and all that stuff. It's like, well, what are you doing? And later on with the Pearls of Decay and Par era Black, it was almost like a different band. I mean, already this turn of events, a lot of Norwegian bands, I've kept saying this many times in previous videos, but around 1997, 1999 roughly. Let's call it 1998 for the sake of fairness. A lot of bands started going so-called Matrix era. Of course, Matrix came a little bit later, but a lot of bands less than 10 years in the game started changing, like abandoning black metal and becoming something different, or adding elements or changing genres, killing bands and all that stuff. And I guess in a way, Hades is part of the whole thing here, because between 1997 and 1999, the difference is big. Bigger maybe than with these two albums, or even this one, even though there's 14 years of time gone before that. But this is also interesting, never listed as inactive band, but if you really think about it, it's more than 20 years since their latest album, the fourth one, which is in my opinion very mediocre. I don't really agree with these high scores here. Maybe these are just from fan point of view. Nothing wrong with that if you like the music, but it's not really something that you could, you know, relate to early 90s black metal. These first two, they're kind of like mid-tempo, almost slow-tempo black metal. It's almost like Black Doom in a way. Kind of like Aeternus, but definitely more blacker, whereas Aeternus went all the way death metal. So in a way, Hades was something different. Not aggressive, not super dark once again, and not overly using keyboards or whatever. I mean, they were no Dimmu Borgir or Emperor for that matter. But lack of speed, a lack of aggression, all that stuff made them quite different from a lot of Norwegian band. I mean, they didn't have that much like folkier tunes either. They never went to rawness or grimness, but more just like slow or mid-tempo, whatever. And it's also interesting if you take a look at this members list. 2 original members still in the band, and one more important is Jørn Inge Tunsberg, who was like part of Immortal, Old Funeral, Amputation, which is definitely worth a side note here, because this is a kind of a Norwegian supergroup acting only for a couple of years, but had members from, people from Immortal, like, Demonas and Bath, and even had other people in the scene. So it's like interesting. This one and Old Funeral are almost like the moments that gave birth to bands as Immortal, Burzum, and what have you. So it's interesting, this all led to different black metal bands back in the days. But whatever happened to Hades in the terms of not writing music anymore, I don't know. Doesn't say inactive or disbanded, but if we're taking really to look here at Metal Hub's discography list, 8 years since the latest EP. And for full length, more than 20 years. So it's interesting to see if they will ever do a comeback. But can't say I really can recommend you the later ones. I mean, if you want to take a look and listen to the albums that made Hottest to stay on the map, it's the two first albums. Much like with Gehenna with the three first albums, or two first albums and first spell. Now, Aeternus comes out as a winner in these terms because, I mean, they have all the way down the same quality with the albums. No slips, no going overboard or off the road or whatever. But if I had to pick my favorite bands, however, here, I would say it's Gehenna because I like their albums more than these other two. But this is not about my opinion. This is about you figuring out which albums to see, which bands to listen to. You probably all know all these three. But in case you don't, or haven't been listening to them for quite some while, which was in my case with Hades, for example, now it's good time to go on the memory lane, down the memory lane, and start listening to some old stuff from the 90s and revisit the past. And who knows what kind of rabbit hole that will take you into, because you will be finding very, very interesting albums along the way and some old vibes you might have even forgotten. That was the case for me anyway. Now, this is this episode's content. What will be in episode 11? Let's find out a little bit later. Now off you go, start listening to some old albums, and I hope you enjoy them. Take care, bye bye.